What would you do if the man who vowed to love you was secretly plotting to strip you of everything? Your home, your dignity, your future. In the stillness of a rural night, there are whispers of a question most people are too afraid to ask. How much of a human body can pigs consume? Before there's nothing left to bury, on a forgotten farm, far from watchful eyes, the soil remembers what the townsfolk refuse to speak of. A husband who vanished, a wife with nothing to lose, and a silence so deep it swallowed the truth for decades. Why was this story buried? Who was paid to keep quiet? And why even now do the locals still lower their voices when they speak her name? Tonight we unearth the chilling tale of Catherine O'Brien, a woman who turned betrayal into the darkest form of revenge history has ever known. The story of Catherine O'Brien begins not with blood, but with paper. Her marriage, like so many in her time, had been less about love and more about stability. 2 families, 2 plots of land, one arrangement meant to hold everything together. For years, she carried the burden of keeping the household alive, tilling soil, raising livestock, maintaining appearances while her husband Thomas increasingly distanced himself from her. The community knew him as a man who enjoyed the company of taverns more than the grind of farm work, and it was whispered that he often spoke of being destined for more than his modest life on the O'Brien farm. Catherine endured it, believing that duty and reputation bound her to a life she had not chosen but could not escape. Yet beneath her patient exterior, something inside her simmered, resentment, exhaustion, and a fear of what her future would become if her husband decided she was no longer of use to him. It was during one of his absences that Catherine discovered the truth. Tucked away among his belongings were documents, letters exchanged with lawyers and land agents, proof that Thomas was quietly planning to strip her of her claim to the farm. Her name, her dowry, the very security she had been promised through marriage, all of it was being maneuvered out of her hands. He had been careful, but not careful enough. The words on the page revealed everything. The transfer of land, the division of assets, the legal loopholes that would render her powerless. She would be left with nothing. Worse still, she would be left with shame. For in a community that judged women by the strength of their household and the loyalty of their husbands, Catherine would be marked as a failure, discarded like worn-out livestock. The realization must have hit her like a blow to the chest. The papers did not simply outline a betrayal of trust. They were a map of her erasure. Every signature, every legal stamp was another shovel of dirt thrown over her name. Catherine would not only lose her farm, she would lose her identity, her ability to survive. In a rural world where women rarely owned property outright and were expected to endure whatever their husbands demanded, the discovery was not just a marital betrayal, it was a death sentence of a different kind. Imagine her in that moment, alone in the farmhouse, candlelight flickering across those damning documents, the sound of pigs snorting outside in the pen, the silence of the night pressing against the windows. Her husband, the man who had once stood beside her at the altar and vowed to protect her, was plotting her ruin. The rage that must have coursed through her veins was no ordinary anger. It was the cold, sharp fury of a woman who understood that her entire existence had been reduced to a footnote in her husband's ambitions. When Thomas returned, the tension between them could no longer be hidden. Neighbors reported hearing arguments, voices raised, doors slammed. Catherine was seen walking the fields alone, her face hard, her eyes hollow. In town, Thomas spoke less of his wife and more of his plans. To some, he claimed he was moving on to a better life. To others, he hinted that Catherine would not be a problem for much longer. Perhaps he believed she was too weak to resist him, too bound by custom and silence to fight back. Perhaps he underestimated the resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The betrayal was not merely financial. It was intimate, personal. Marriage in that time was not easily escaped, especially for a woman. Divorce was rare, scandalous, and left women destitute. To know that her husband was preparing to cast her out without even offering the thin dignity of an honest departure was more than insult. It was annihilation. Catherine had spent years laboring on that farm, feeding animals, sowing fields, keeping a household that others took for granted. In her mind, every callus on her hands was a stake in that land, every scar a testament to her claim. For him to take it all was not just theft, it was erasure of her very life. This is the moment where something inside Catherine shifted. The thought of humiliation, of destitution, of standing in front of neighbors as a discarded wife with nowhere to go, weighed heavier than the moral teachings of the church or the warnings of conscience. Her desperation grew teeth, and her anger sharpened into a plan. The betrayal had unmoored her from the quiet endurance she had lived by. She was no longer simply a wife. She was a woman fighting for survival, her mind turning toward paths most would not dare to tread. When people later whispered of what happened on that farm, they often spoke of Catherine's silence. She did not wail or beg. She did not run to neighbors for help. Instead, she carried the knowledge of his betrayal like a stone in her chest, letting it anchor her resolve. The cruel irony of it all was that Thomas believed himself to be clever, believed the law would protect him as it so often protected men of his standing. But the law was slow, the courts distant, and Catherine's rage immediate. He had calculated everything but her response. The seeds of the act were planted in the very betrayal he orchestrated. It was his decision to leave her with nothing that turned her into something he could not imagine. A woman willing to take control of her fate in the most brutal way possible. The documents, the whispers, the smugness of his plans, they became the tinder that lit the fire. When Catherine finally struck back, she was not acting from impulse alone, but from a slow-burning fuse that had been set alight by the betrayal of the man who should have been her protector. The first key to understanding the Catherine O'Brien murder case is not the grisly act itself, but the betrayal that preceded it. Without the discovery of those papers, without the realization that her husband had intended to discard her as though she were nothing, there may never have been blood in the soil or bones in the trough. But once Catherine understood the depth of his deceit, once she saw her entire future collapsing into nothing, the path toward darkness was no longer unthinkable. It became, in her mind, inevitable. The countryside where Catherine and Thomas O'Brien lived was a place shaped as much by silence as by sound. Vast stretches of farmland separated one family from the next, creating a kind of enforced solitude where daily life was measured in chores, weather, and the slow march of seasons. In such an environment, secrets could survive longer than in any crowded city. The fields and forests kept their own counsel, and neighbors, though curious, learned quickly that minding other people's affairs could invite trouble. This was the world Catherine inhabited, a rural community where appearances mattered, but where the deeper truths of marriage, betrayal, and violence could be quietly concealed beneath the routines of farm life. Isolation was not only physical, but emotional. Women like Catherine lived within a structure that demanded obedience and endurance. They worked the land alongside their husbands, yet the law and custom denied them ownership or independence. If a husband left or decided to sell, the wife had little recourse. The church reminded them of duty. The neighbors judged them on reputation, and the law rarely came to their defense. This meant that a woman's survival often depended entirely on the stability of her marriage. In such a fragile balance, the fear of abandonment was not just a personal wound, but a threat to existence itself. Catherine lived with this constant reality, and it created a pressure that only deepened her despair once she discovered her husband's intentions. Life on the O'Brien farm reflected the broader hardships of rural living. There were no luxuries, no distractions to dull the grind. Days began before dawn with the feeding of livestock, the mending of tools, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. Evenings were filled with the monotonous sounds of animals settling, wind rattling the windows, and the occasional distant laughter of men in town taverns. For women, this monotony was compounded by loneliness. Many endured their isolation quietly, bound by the unspoken rule that private grievances were not to be made public. To speak of a husband's cruelty or betrayal would bring shame, not sympathy. Catherine's silence, both before and after her husband's disappearance, was typical of the time, a silence shaped not by indifference but by the crushing weight of expectation. The community around her operated on whispers rather than confrontations. When someone failed to appear in town, when a field went untended or a barn stayed locked, people speculated in hushed tones. Yet few took action. The isolation of rural life bred a kind of willful blindness. Neighbors noticed, but they did not interfere unless trouble spilled beyond the boundaries of a farm. This reluctance to pry allowed situations like Catherine's to escalate unchecked. Even when arguments were heard drifting from the O'Brien farm, even when Thomas's absence stretched from days to weeks, People chose to accept her explanations rather than challenge them. To push further would mean exposing uncomfortable truths, and most preferred their own peace over entanglement in another family's misfortune. It is within this environment of rural silence that Catherine's betrayal takes on a darker tone. She was not simply a woman wronged by her husband's scheming. She was a woman trapped in a world that offered her no outlet for justice or protection. Had she been in a city, perhaps she might have found work or kin to shelter her. In the countryside, the options narrowed to almost nothing. The church would not dissolve her marriage. The courts would side with her husband. Her neighbors might gossip, but they would not intervene. The land itself, stretching wide and indifferent, became both her prison and her accomplice. The pigs, too, were part of this landscape. They were not pets, but essential assets. Animals raised for meat, fattened for market. Their voracious appetites, both a blessing and a danger. Every farmer knew what pigs could do to refuse, scraps, even carrion. The knowledge that pigs could consume flesh was not a secret. It was a grim fact of rural life. In Catherine's isolation, surrounded by creatures bred to strip bone clean, the thought may have come to her naturally. The farm itself offered the means to conceal her husband's betrayal in the most final way imaginable. What might seem unthinkable in a more connected world was, in her circumstances, a terrifyingly practical solution. The silence of the community played directly into this possibility. When Thomas vanished, Catherine's explanation was accepted with little challenge. Some neighbors might have suspected more, but suspicion without evidence was nothing in a place where the law came slowly and gossip carried more weight than proof. People avoided confrontation not only out of politeness but out of fear. To accuse a neighbor of something monstrous risked alienation, retaliation, or worse, becoming entangled in something dangerous. So the whispers stayed whispers. Catherine was left alone with her story, and the community, perhaps relieved not to confront the darkness beneath its surface, let the matter rest. This silence extended even to the investigation. When officials were finally called, it was not because of urgent concern but because the whispers grew too persistent to ignore. By then, time and isolation had already erased much of the evidence. Pigs had done their work, the soil had swallowed its secrets, and Catherine's calm composure presented little for interrogators to seize upon. In a city, her husband's absence might have been quickly noted, traced through business dealings or social engagements. In the countryside, months could pass without a man's presence being remarked upon. This delay was crucial. It allowed Catherine's act to sink into the fabric of rural life, becoming less a shocking event than a quiet, unsettling possibility. The isolation of the O'Brien farm did more than conceal the crime. It shaped its very nature. Catherine's decision was born from the knowledge that no one would rescue her, that no authority would shield her from her husband's betrayal. Her environment taught her that survival depended not on pleading for justice, but on taking it for herself. The pigs, the silence, the neighbors who looked away, all of it formed a perfect storm that allowed her act to unfold and remain hidden, for as long as it did. To understand Catherine O'Brien is to understand the oppressive quiet of rural life. It was a world where women had no voice, where men wielded both legal and social power, where land was more valuable than people, and where silence protected the guilty as often as it punished the innocent. In that silence, Catherine's betrayal took root, and in that same silence, her husband's fate was consumed piece by piece until almost nothing remained. The breaking point for Catherine O'Brien was not a single moment of fury but the slow tightening of a noose woven from betrayal, humiliation, and despair. Every day after she uncovered her husband's secret plans must have felt like a fresh cut to her dignity. She still woke before dawn to tend to the animals, still trudged through the fields, still went about her chores, yet every task was now haunted by the knowledge that none of it mattered. The farm she labored over was already being signed away, her sweat and toil converted into a profit that she would never see. It was as if she had become a ghost in her own life, existing only to serve a future that excluded her. That awareness gnawed at her, transforming ordinary duties into unbearable reminders of the futility of her existence. The human mind has a threshold for suffering. Some endure quietly until their last breath. Others crack in sudden violent bursts. For Catherine, the betrayal was not a secret she could ignore. Each passing day intensified her rage, and in the harsh silence of rural life, There was nowhere to escape it. The loneliness of the farm, once tolerable, now pressed down upon her like a coffin lid. Conversations with neighbors were shallow, the church provided little more than platitudes, and the law offered no relief. Every avenue that might have saved her closed in, one by one, until she stood alone against the enormity of her fate. That isolation became the crucible in which her breaking point was forged. Thomas himself did nothing to ease her torment. If anything, his arrogance deepened it. He carried himself as though his schemes were already accomplished, dismissive of Catherine, certain that she could neither stop him nor dare to try. Some said he grew more cruel in those final weeks, taunting her with veiled remarks about her future, mocking her usefulness, treating her as if she were already gone from his life. To Catherine, every word must have felt like a hammer striking the fragile shell of her composure. The man she had once called husband had transformed into an executioner, his pen and paper dealing a sentence more final than any blade. And yet, beneath her outward silence, something was shifting. Resentment became resolve. Fear gave way to a cold kind of courage. Catherine was not rash. She was deliberate. The thought of confronting him openly, begging him to reconsider, must have crossed her mind, but she knew the futility of it. Men like Thomas did not yield to pleading, and the law would stand at his side if she tried to fight him through courts or petitions. She understood with piercing clarity that the system was designed to strip her of agency. And so she turned inward, searching for a different kind of justice, one that did not require permission or recognition. The nights on the farm grew darker. Accounts from neighbors described hearing sharp bursts of argument carried on the wind, followed by long stretches of silence. Catherine, they said, walked the property like a sentinel, her figure outlined against the fields in the dim light of the moon. Some swore she spoke to herself, her lips moving without sound. Perhaps she was rehearsing words she would never say aloud, imagining confrontations that in reality would never be spoken. What no one could see was the storm gathering inside her, the relentless drumbeat of betrayal that drove her thoughts toward the unthinkable. When the breaking point finally arrived, it was not sudden but inevitable. Catherine must have looked at her husband not as a man, but as the embodiment of everything that sought to erase her. He was no longer Thomas the farmer, Thomas the husband. He was the thief of her future, the destroyer of her identity, the architect of her ruin. To allow him to live was to accept her own annihilation. And so, she crossed the line that separates thought from action. The decision was not made in a frenzy of passion, but with the cold determination of someone who had exhausted every other possibility. The plan itself, though ghastly, carried a brutal logic. Catherine knew the pigs, knew what they could do, knew that once Thomas disappeared into that pen, there would be little left for the world to find. It was the kind of solution born not of madness but of grim practicality. The farm had offered her no protection, the law no justice, but the animals, creatures of appetite and instinct, would give her both revenge and concealment. To feed her husband to the pigs was not simply to kill him. It was to erase him in the same way he had tried to erase her. Every bite, every bone ground to fragments, became a grotesque mirror of the betrayal he had inflicted on her life. Afterward, Catherine's composure astonished those who encountered her. She did not collapse into hysterics or display the guilt of a panicked criminal. Instead, she carried on with a steady calm, tending to the farm as though nothing had changed. The neighbors who came by saw a woman quiet and unsmiling, but not broken. To them, Thomas's absence was peculiar but not alarming. Men vanished often in those days, chasing work, fleeing debts, or abandoning families. Catherine's explanation, that he had gone west, that he had left her behind, was believable enough. It was, in fact, the kind of story people preferred to believe, because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The breaking point, then, was not only Catherine's descent into violence, but the moment she embraced a silence that shielded her from suspicion. She had severed herself from the expectations of society, stepped beyond the roles of wife, neighbor, parishioner, and remade herself into something both feared and misunderstood. She was a woman who had clawed back her agency from the jaws of despair, not through law or prayer, but through an act of horror. Her breaking point was the collision of betrayal and survival. The point where desperation demanded action and morality was left behind in the shadows of the farmhouse. What makes Catherine's breaking point so unsettling is not just the act itself. but the clarity with which she reached it. This was not the chaos of madness, but the grim resolve of someone who believed they had been left with no other choice. It was the quiet transformation of a woman stripped of hope, a woman who turned the tools of her oppression, her farm, her animals, her isolation, into weapons. The pigs that once symbolized her toil became the agents of her revenge, and in their hunger, they consumed not just a man but the illusions of safety and order that bound her world together. The method Catherine O'Brien chose to rid herself of her husband was not the frenzied act of a woman out of her mind, but a plan stitched together from knowledge of her surroundings and the brutal logic of her circumstances. To the outside world, the farm was an unremarkable place, no different from countless others scattered across the countryside. But within its fences lived creatures whose very nature could turn it into a chamber of erasure. Pigs were essential to survival, both valuable and voracious, capable of devouring nearly anything placed before them. Farmers knew their appetite was unmatched, that they would strip a carcass clean and leave behind little more than fragments. It was this fact, common knowledge in rural life, that gave Catherine her weapon. She did not need knives sharper than those she already owned, nor poisons that might be traced. What she needed was to let the animals do what they were bred to do. When the moment arrived, whether sparked by a sudden confrontation or a simmering resolve reaching its peak, Catherine acted with a cold practicality. Accounts suggest that Thomas was last seen on the property after one of their bitter quarrels, the argument carrying into the night. No one could testify to what happened next, but the evidence whispered of a violent clash within the farmhouse itself. Some speculated she struck him with a blunt instrument, others that she poisoned him and waited for his collapse. The exact manner of his death would never be confirmed, for what followed left little behind to examine. What is certain is that Thomas never left the farm alive, and Catherine, in her silence, offered no explanation. The pigs became both accomplice and grave. To feed a body to them required grim determination, yet Catherine, hardened by years of labor and embittered by betrayal, found the resolve. Once Thomas was cast into the pen, the animal's instincts did the rest. Their squeals filled the night, masking what would otherwise have been the unmistakable sounds of death. For hours, perhaps longer, the creatures tore flesh from bone, consuming what would have been a corpse to be buried. Catherine, standing nearby, must have watched with a mixture of horror and grim relief as the evidence of her crime dissolved under their teeth. It was a grotesque transformation. The man who sought to leave her destitute reduced to feed for livestock. His betrayal erased in the most visceral way imaginable. The brilliance of the method lay in its concealment. Where a burial could be discovered and a fire might leave incriminating remains, pigs left almost nothing. A tooth here, a shard of bone there, fragments so small they could be mistaken for refuse or crushed into the earth. Investigators later would find scant evidence, insufficient to establish guilt beyond suspicion. By choosing this path, Catherine weaponized the very ordinariness of farm life. To slaughter livestock was expected, to feed pigs scraps was routine, and the disappearance of organic matter within their pen was hardly remarkable. In this way, her crime hid itself in plain sight, disguised as the daily rhythm of rural survival. The grotesque intimacy of the act cannot be ignored. Catherine had shared a bed with Thomas, worked beside him, endured his presence for years. To feed him to the animals she herself tended was more than murder. It was a statement. It was a refusal to let him vanish on his own terms. If he planned to erase her by law, she would erase him by flesh. The pigs, indifferent to human dramas, became the arbiters of justice in a marriage that had collapsed into betrayal and rage. What they consumed was not only a body, but the illusion of order that bound the community together. Neighbors clung to the belief that families, however troubled, remained intact. Catherine shattered that illusion by transforming her household into a scene of unimaginable horror. The method also exploited the blindness of the community. Pigs were noisy creatures, their feeding frenzies loud and chaotic, but such sounds were not unusual. If neighbors heard their squeals that night, they dismissed them as routine, unaware of the horror unfolding just beyond their fences. Even when Thomas failed to appear in town, the explanation Catherine offered, that he had left her, as men often did, was accepted without challenge. Her calm demeanor, paired with the ordinary tasks of running the farm, shielded her from suspicion. No one wished to probe further. for to do so might force them to confront the truth of what those pigs had consumed. The few remains that did surface, scattered fragments found months later, were ambiguous. Investigators faced a puzzle with missing pieces, and Catherine's silence gave them nothing to work with. Forensic science of the time lacked the precision to make definitive conclusions. What could be proven was insufficient for conviction, and what could not be proven haunted the imagination of everyone who heard the tale. The pigs had done their work too well, reducing a man to whispers and rumors. Catherine's choice of method also reflected a chilling inversion of the farm's purpose. Livestock were meant to sustain life, to provide meat for the table and coin for the market. By turning them into instruments of destruction, she blurred the line between sustenance and savagery. Her survival was secured not through the usual sale of animals, but through the concealment they offered. The farm, once a symbol of shared labor between husband and wife, became a stage for vengeance where every element, the isolation, the animals, the silence, played its part. What makes the act unforgettable is its grotesque practicality. Catherine did not conjure elaborate plots or attempt delicate poisons. She relied on the brutal efficiency of nature itself. In doing so, she revealed a truth often buried beneath the civility of society. Survival sometimes demands methods as primal as the instincts of the animals we raise. For Catherine, betrayed and cornered, the pigs were not merely livestock. They were a solution, a shield, and a grim reflection of the hunger that betrayal had awakened within her. The method she chose ensured that her husband's end would remain as murky as her own fate. Even when she stood before judges and jurors, their suspicions heavy in the air, they could not point to the remains of Thomas with certainty. They could only imagine, piecing together rumors and fragments, haunted by the possibility that what was whispered in taverns and fields was true, that Catherine O'Brien had turned her husband into nothing more than feed for the farm animals that had long depended on her care. In that possibility lay the horror, the fascination, and the enduring legacy of her crime. The morning began with a silence that was heavy, a kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Catherine O'Brien stood in her small farmhouse kitchen, staring at the wooden table where bills, legal papers, and debt notices lay scattered like a storm had passed through them. She knew what they meant. Her husband, Patrick, had been preparing to leave her, stripping her of everything she had built, leaving her with nothing but ruin. It was not just abandonment. It was betrayal, financial destruction, and social annihilation all woven into one cruel act. The air smelled faintly of the smoke from last night's fire, the lingering traces of ash mixing with the dampness of early morning. It was in that moment she realized what awaited her if she did nothing: destitution, humiliation, and a life where survival was barely within reach. Patrick O'Brien had grown distant over the months, his demeanor changing from that of a hard-working farmer to a man obsessed with greed and control. Neighbors whispered about his dealings with land agents and his late-night meetings in town. Catherine had tried to ignore it, hoping it was temporary, but the documents she found told the full story. He had been transferring assets, changing names on deeds, arranging his affairs to ensure that when he walked out the door, Catherine would be left with neither land nor livestock. She would not even have the roof over her head. Every shovel of dirt Patrick lifted to build their farm had now turned into a weapon against her, his labor transformed into a tool of erasure. For Catherine, who had endured years of back-breaking work, childbirth, and sacrifice, the revelation was not just devastating, it was enraging. The farmhouse, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap. Catherine wandered through the rooms, her hand tracing along the cracked plaster walls. Each corner reminded her of sacrifices, long winters where she kept the fire burning while Patrick disappeared into town, summers spent harvesting fields under a punishing sun, nights she lay awake tending to sick children. Everything was tied to her blood and sweat, and yet Patrick intended to cast her aside as though she were a servant whose usefulness had expired. This was not merely abandonment. It was erasure of her existence, a rewriting of their life in which she played no role. And the cruelest part? Society would not come to her aid. In those times, a husband's authority was absolute, his property rights unchallenged. A wife without her husband's support was invisible, powerless, discarded like waste. The pigs in the yard squealed faintly, their guttural sounds drifting into the kitchen window. Catherine looked at them with an odd detachment. The animals were hungry as always, impatient for their morning feeding. They were creatures of instinct, consuming whatever was placed before them, never questioning, never pausing. Something about that simplicity rooted itself in Catherine's mind. Patrick had always mocked her devotion to the pigs, sneering at the time she spent caring for them. "They're just beasts," he would say, "good for meat and nothing else." Yet Catherine knew differently. She had seen what those animals could do when hungry. Their jaws were merciless, their teeth grinding through bone as if it were nothing. In their appetite lay a kind of brutal honesty, no pretense, no deception. They consumed what the world gave them without shame. For Catherine, who was suffocating under betrayal and lies, that brutal honesty began to feel like an answer. Patrick returned late that day, his boots caked in mud, his face flushed with the satisfaction of secret victories. He barely looked at Catherine as he entered, tossing his coat carelessly onto a chair. His words were curt, dismissive. He had meetings to attend, business to finish, things Catherine wouldn't understand. But Catherine had already seen enough. She knew what he was planning, and worse, she knew that he considered her irrelevant. The rage inside her was quiet but relentless, a steady current beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. She listened as Patrick muttered about debts, land sales, and his new arrangements, his voice dripping with arrogance. In that moment, Catherine realized she was already a ghost to him, an obstacle he had erased from his story. That realization did not break her. It hardened her. That night, as Patrick drank heavily in the parlor, Catherine moved silently through the kitchen. The knives glinted faintly under the dim light, their metal edges sharp and unforgiving. She did not rush. She did not panic. Every movement was deliberate, as though she had rehearsed it in her mind for years. The pigs outside shuffled restlessly, their snorts rising and falling in the darkness. Catherine's hands trembled only once, when she thought of the children asleep in their beds, unaware of the storm unfolding in the house. But she steadied herself quickly. This was not an act of madness. It was survival. It was justice in a world where no law would protect her, where the courts would side with Patrick, and where the community would brand her weak and disposable if she simply endured. When Patrick finally stumbled into the kitchen, his eyes glazed and his speech slurred, Catherine saw not her husband but the architect of her destruction. His presence filled the room with the stench of whiskey and arrogance, and in his smirk, Catherine saw the certainty that she could do nothing to stop him. But he was wrong. In one swift motion, the silence of the farmhouse was shattered. Patrick's shocked cry cut through the air, then was swallowed by the weight of inevitability. The struggle was brief, violent, and final. Catherine's breath came in short gasps, her hands steady even as the enormity of her act pressed upon her. She stood over him, her face pale but resolved. She had done what needed to be done. Outside, the pigs stirred restlessly. Their hunger was insistent, a chorus of guttural sounds echoing into the night. Catherine dragged Patrick's lifeless body toward the pen, each step heavy with a grim determination. The pigs surged forward as she opened the gate, their frenzy immediate and merciless. The sound was horrifying, a chorus of tearing and grinding that seemed to echo from the very depths of hell. Catherine turned away, unable to watch, but she did not stop. The pigs did what they always did. They consumed without question, without pause, reducing Patrick's body to nothing more than sustenance. It was gruesome, but in a twisted way, it was also poetic. The man who had sought to leave her with nothing now himself became nothing, devoured by creatures he had always scorned. When the night finally fell silent again, Catherine stood alone in the yard. The stars above glimmered faintly, indifferent to the human tragedy below. Her hands were stained, her body weary, but her spirit strangely calm. The world had pushed her into a corner, stripping her of choices, and she had answered in the only way she could. There would be questions, suspicions, perhaps even investigations. But for now, the house was quiet, the pigs were sated, and Catherine was no longer powerless. She had taken control of her story, seizing it back from a man who sought to erase her. In the darkness, with only the whisper of the wind and the distant rustle of the pigs, Catherine O'Brien stood as both victim and executioner, bound forever to the terrible choice she had made. The disappearance of Patrick O'Brien did not go unnoticed, but in those rural stretches of farmland, a man going missing was not entirely uncommon. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about men who left families behind to seek new fortunes, often disappearing into the anonymity of distant towns. Some returned after years, hollow-eyed and broken, while others vanished entirely, their absence explained away by whispers of drink, gambling, or debts gone bad. So when Patrick was no longer seen walking through the village, no longer visiting taverns with his loud voice and heavier coin, people wondered, but they did not yet suspect the truth. Catherine was careful, calculated, never revealing too much. When asked, she explained with a practiced calm that Patrick had gone on business, handling debts and land matters. Her voice carried just enough resignation, just enough weariness, that neighbors assumed she had been abandoned. Pity, after all, was easier than suspicion, but Catherine knew the dangers that lay ahead. A disappearance was not a clean slate. It was a wound that attracted attention, flies, and eventually questions. At night she sat by the window, candlelight flickering against her face, and wondered how long the silence would last before someone knocked on her door. The pigs outside were restless as the days passed, rooting in the mud with their usual hunger, but for Catherine, their sounds became an uneasy reminder of what they had consumed. She could still hear it sometimes, the tearing, the grinding, the way the animals had surged with frenzy. It haunted her, yet it also protected her. Patrick was gone in a way few men ever were. There would be no body to find, no grave to dig, no remains to uncover. And in that absence, Catherine found both safety and terror. Safety, because the evidence was gone. Terror, because absence itself could ignite suspicion. The community's pity began to turn into curiosity. At church, women glanced toward Catherine with a mixture of sympathy and quiet judgment. Was she a widow now or merely abandoned? In that time, either fate carried shame. Men who deserted their families left behind women to struggle, often reduced to begging or relying on charity. A widow, meanwhile, bore the sorrow of death but retained a measure of dignity. Catherine straddled an uneasy space between the two. She dressed in muted colors, carried herself with a subdued demeanor, but she never claimed widowhood outright. To do so might invite questions about proof, about a body, about a burial. Instead, she leaned into silence, letting others fill the void with their own assumptions. The more they whispered, the safer she became. Still, the authorities eventually noticed Patrick's absence. A man with land holdings and financial entanglements could not vanish without consequence. Questions arose in town, creditors asking after debts, land agents wondering about signatures. Catherine found herself summoned to answer inquiries. Each time she presented herself with a calm exterior, explaining that Patrick had gone to settle affairs elsewhere, perhaps even across county lines. Her words were measured, her eyes steady, though inside her heart raced with every question. She knew one slip, one crack in her story, could unravel everything. But Catherine had lived a life of endurance, and endurance had trained her well. She bore their scrutiny as she had borne winters and betrayals, with patience and a steel hidden beneath her modest frame. The children, though innocent, posed the greatest risk. They asked where their father had gone, their voices carrying the unfiltered curiosity only children possessed. Catherine answered gently, telling them he was away on business, telling them he might not return soon. But children have a way of speaking freely, of repeating words at the wrong time. Neighbors began to notice their confusion, their questions. Some whispered that Catherine had been abandoned, that Patrick had left for good, perhaps with another woman. That theory spread quickly, for it fit neatly into the world's understanding of men and their vices. A man leaving his wife for another was shameful, but it was believable. It explained the silence without invoking darker possibilities. Catherine allowed that rumor to grow, even fed it subtly, knowing it shielded her more effectively than any lie she could invent. Yet she was not free. At night, the farmhouse creaked under the weight of its secrets. Every sound in the dark made Catherine tense, fearing discovery. The pigs, once ordinary creatures, had become accomplices in her mind, silent, hungry beasts that had devoured her past and protected her future. Sometimes she stared at them for long minutes, wondering if they remembered, if some trace of Patrick lingered in their restless eyes. The thought unsettled her, yet it also bound her to them. They were her guardians now, their silence as crucial as her own. And still, there were moments when she wondered if the land itself betrayed her. The soil where Patrick had once worked, the fences he had mended, the barn he had built, All of it seemed to whisper his name. Erasing him from the earth was impossible, no matter how thoroughly the pigs had done their work. As weeks turned into months, Catherine began to believe she might survive the scrutiny. The authorities grew distracted with other matters. Neighbors busied themselves with their own hardships, and Patrick's absence became less of a shock and more of a settled fact. But survival came with a cost. Catherine could no longer live freely, could no longer speak openly. Every conversation was a performance, every gesture measured. She lived in fear of slips of the tongue, of the children saying too much, of a neighbor noticing something amiss. Her solitude deepened, not only because Patrick was gone, but because she could never share the truth with anyone. Secrets of that magnitude demand silence, and silence is its own kind of prison. Yet there was another shadow, darker still, that haunted her. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the only sound was the wind outside, Catherine wondered if Patrick truly deserved what she had done. Rage had guided her, betrayal had fueled her, but in the stillness, doubt crept in. Had she acted too swiftly? Could there have been another way? Those thoughts clawed at her mind, leaving her sleepless, pacing through the farmhouse while the candle burned low. She told herself again and again that Patrick would have destroyed her, left her with nothing. That without her act she would be destitute, powerless, erased. And yet, the human heart is rarely at peace when it holds blood on its hands. The story of Catherine O'Brien lingered in the shadows of her community, unspoken but never fully forgotten. Some believed Patrick had abandoned her, others suspected something darker but dared not voice it aloud. In those days, suspicion without proof was little more than gossip, and gossip alone could not summon justice. Catherine carried on, tending her land, raising her children, feeding her pigs. But beneath every ordinary act lay the weight of what she had done. The pigs grunted and rooted in the mud, their appetites never sated, and Catherine knew that as long as they lived, they carried within them a secret too dangerous to ever name aloud. The years that followed did not wash Catherine O'Brien clean of what she had done. They only deepened the shadows around her. Life continued outwardly, as it always does. The fields still demanded planting, the livestock still clamored for food, and the children still grew into their own shapes and voices. To neighbors passing by, the O'Brien farm looked much like any other. A widow's house, weathered but intact, with its pigs grunting in the yard and smoke curling from the chimney on cold mornings. People pitied Catherine in their quiet way, seeing her as a woman wronged by her husband's desertion. Some even admired her resilience, the way she kept the land running alone. But Catherine herself lived in a different world, one layered with silence, memory, and an ever-present awareness of what the soil and the animals around her concealed. Time did not erase Patrick. If anything, his absence grew louder as the years stretched on. Every knock on the door set Catherine's heart racing. Every unfamiliar rider on the road made her pause at the window, watching to see if they turned toward her house. The law had long since grown indifferent, writing Patrick off as another man who had fled from debt or duty. But Catherine never allowed herself to believe she was safe. She carried the knowledge of what she had done like a second heartbeat, always pulsing just beneath the surface. Her nights were restless, haunted by sounds she could not silence. Sometimes it was the remembered shriek of Patrick in his final moments. Other times the wet, terrible chorus of pigs tearing through what she had given them. Even when the animals were long gone, slaughtered or sold, their echoes lingered in her mind. Her children were her only anchor, though even they became mirrors of her unease. As they grew older, their questions became sharper, more difficult to brush aside. Why had their father never returned? Why had no letter arrived, no news from some distant town? Catherine offered what explanations she could. Patrick had gone to escape debts, perhaps even fled across the ocean, as some men did when they wished to vanish entirely. But children grow into adults, and adults learn to weigh stories against silence. There were moments when she caught them looking at her with uncertainty, suspicion buried under filial loyalty. Did they ever guess? Did they ever suspect the truth their mother bore alone? Catherine never knew. She only knew that she had to keep the story intact, even if it meant living as a ghost within her own family. The land itself seemed complicit in her secret. Every furrow in the field, every stone in the wall carried the memory of Patrick's labor. Catherine sometimes felt as though the farm was caught between two truths, the one she showed the world and the one buried in its shadows. On stormy nights when the wind rattled the shutters and rain pounded against the earth, she could almost hear his voice in the howl, mocking her from beyond. These were not the superstitions of a frightened woman, but the torment of someone who understood that guilt has a way of reshaping reality. Once a life has been taken, the world itself feels altered. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow becomes suspect. Catherine's relationship with the pigs became something neighbors quietly remarked upon. She seemed to treat them differently from other farmers, spending more time with them than was considered ordinary. People thought it was a kind of eccentricity, perhaps the lingering loneliness of a woman abandoned. But Catherine knew it was more than that. The pigs were reminders, witnesses in their own mute way. They had consumed Patrick, erased him from flesh into nothingness, and in that act they had bound themselves to her fate. She could not look at them without remembering, and yet she could not part from them easily either. They were her shield, the creatures that had made it possible for her to carry on. To others they were just animals, but to Catherine they were guardians of her darkest truth. The years did not bring peace, but they did bring a kind of dull rhythm. Rumors eventually softened into background noise, Patrick's name spoken less frequently, then hardly at all. The community accepted the story of his desertion, and Catherine became, in their eyes, the long-suffering wife left to fend for herself. But if the outside world forgot, Catherine never did. Age crept upon her, and with it came the weight of solitude. Friends passed away, children grew and left, and the house grew quieter. In that silence, memories became sharper, less forgiving. She replayed her choices endlessly, turning them over like stones in her hands, as though she might find a different shape hidden beneath. But the outcome was always the same. Patrick was gone, and she had sent him there. Whether he deserved it or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had crossed a threshold no one could return from. As she grew older, Catherine found herself speaking to Patrick in the empty rooms of the farmhouse. At first it was in anger, venting the rage she had once carried silently. But over time the conversation softened into something closer to regret, even longing. She spoke not only to the man he had been, but to the man he might have been if greed and betrayal had not poisoned him. She wondered what her life would have been had things taken a different turn, had betrayal not forced her hand. These late-night confessions were never heard by anyone else, yet they kept her company, a reminder that even the dead can haunt the living not through presence, but through absence. By the time her own end drew near, Catherine had become a figure half forgotten by her community. She was the widow on the farm, stooped with age, her eyes shadowed with secrets no one cared to uncover. The world moved on. New scandals replaced old whispers, and Patrick O'Brien became a ghost in name only. Yet the darkness of what had transpired remained lodged in the earth, in the bones of the farmhouse, in the very air Catherine breathed. She had escaped the law, escaped suspicion, but she had not escaped herself. The prison she built was invisible yet unyielding, a cage of silence and memory. What makes Catherine's story endure is not simply the brutality of her act, but the way it reveals the desperation of a woman cornered by her time and circumstances. She lived in a world where women had little recourse, where betrayal could strip them of everything, and where survival often demanded choices that defied morality. Catherine's decision was terrible, yes, but it was also born of that reality, a reality that left her with no safe path, only dangerous ones. Her story is both a cautionary tale and a grim testament to the lengths the human spirit will go when faced with erasure. And though her neighbors may have remembered her as a widow abandoned, history whispers another truth, that in the quiet of a lonely farm, justice and horror once shared the same table, and Catherine O'Brien bore their weight until the day she died. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on what you've just heard. The story of Catherine O'Brien isn't simply a tale of crime. It's a haunting reminder of what desperation, betrayal, and silence can drive a human being to do. It forces us to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. How far would you go if you were left with nothing? What choices would you make if every door around you was closed, and survival meant stepping into the unthinkable? These are not just stories from the past. They are warnings, echoes of human nature that still resonate today. And it's precisely why we dive into these dark corners of history, not to sensationalize, but to uncover the hidden truths that society tried to bury. Because if we don't confront them, they repeat themselves in silence. If you found yourself unsettled, captivated, or even questioning what you thought you knew, then you're exactly where you need to be. This channel is dedicated to peeling back the layers of forgotten crimes, forbidden histories, and the shadows of human behavior. By subscribing, you become part of a community that doesn't look away when history gets uncomfortable. We stare it in the face, together. So if you're ready to keep exploring the darkest stories history tried to silence, hit that subscribe button now. And tell me in the comments, do you believe Catherine O'Brien was a murderer driven by rage, or a survivor with no other choice? Your thoughts may reveal more than you realize.